Well, hello, good afternoon, and welcome, everybody. It is my pleasure to be introducing Richard Weiser this afternoon. Richard is a versatile writer of prose, poetry, song lyrics, and ad copy. He started his working life in broadcast journalism after he returned to school to study creative writing with Governor General's Award winner Don Coles. After university, Richard tripped and fell into a career in advertising and recently won a Cannes Lion advertising version of the Oscar. Richard attended Humber School of Writers in 2014, where he worked on his Tom Thomson manuscript with Olive Sr. He is a member of the League of Canadian Poets and SOCAN. His poetry has been published internationally in journals such as HCE, Acumen, and Gravel, and his play, Jishin, was produced at the Toronto Fringe Festival. Richard is also a fourth-generation cottager on Lake of Bays. Please give a warm welcome to Richard Weiser.
Thank you very much, Gail. And thanks to Gary and the Muskoka Chautauqua organization for having me here. I was telling Gail and Sean as I arrived, we were looking at literary festivals, my publisher and I said, there's one that I absolutely have to do with my Thomson book, and it's this one. How could you write a book about Tom Thomson and not talk about it right here, just down the street from where Thomson painted all of his greatest paintings? And you know, being here and hearing Lake Rosso in the background and you know, feeling the breeze, you know, I just feel like this is the perfect place to talk about Thomson. So I'm going to read a little bit from my book, which I call The Real Mystery of Tom Thomson. And I'm going to talk about what the mystery is from my perspective. And I would really love to talk to you. I'm going to leave some time at the end to talk about Thomson. It's my favorite thing to do. And, you know, frankly, one of the best things about writing a book about Tom Thomson is there's this sort of secret fraternity of writers who write books about Tom Thomson. And, you know, they call you up or, you know, send you an email. And so I've got to talk to these other people who are as passionate as I am about Thomson. So I hope that some of you out there are like me, love to talk about Thomson, and at the end of this, let's chat some more about your favorite paintings and you know, what you think about his work. So, as I said, my book is called The Real Mystery of Tom Thomson, and the idea here being that, you know, although there have been many books written about Thomson's death, which, you know, may or may not have been murder, and where his body is buried, but to me, a far more interesting mystery is how someone with no formal art school education in only 4 years was able to produce hundreds of canvases that have captured the imagination of a nation for, you know, over 100 years now. To me, this is a truly remarkable thing. Harris painted till he was almost 90, Thomson's friend. MacDonald, he died young. He only had 20 years to paint. Thomson painted for 4. You know, it's truly remarkable. And I think I have an idea of, you know, what he was thinking when he was painting and how he was able to actually get all these amazing canvases, and I'm excited to share it with you. First, I'm going to read a little bit from the start and talk about how I came to write this book. I discovered Tom Thomson in the fall of 1980. Canadian pride was high in Pierre Trudeau's Canada, and I was receptive to the Notable Canadians section of grade 6 social studies. The intrepid painter loomed large amongst luminaries such as Laura Secord, record-breaking athlete Tom Longboat, and the heroic Doctor Norman Bethune. What really hooked me on Thomson was that he was a canoeist, and he had lived in and painted Algonquin Park. My great-grandfather had built a cottage on nearby Lake of Bays, and I was a decent canoeist myself, having mastered the elusive J-stroke the previous summer. I loved the rocky terrain, the sandy lakes, the jagged pines and bone-white birches. For me, it was a refuge from the monotony of the suburbs and the social challenges of public school. It was a dissonance, however, that the landscapes he painted were inhospitable and sinister. The most influential analysis of Thomson's paintings comes from cultural theorist Northrop Frye, who in the 1940s wrote, "What is essential in Thomson is the imaginative instability, the emotional unrest and dissatisfaction one feels about a country which has not been lived in, the tension between the mind and a surrounding not integrated with it." In several pictures, one has the feeling of something not quite emerging, which is all the more sinister for its concealment. Frye called this sinister something the Canadian Sphinx, which I wanted to call the book, but publishers had different ideas. When the Canadian Sphinx brought her riddle of unvisualized land to Thomson, it did not occur to him to hide under the bedclothes, though she did not promise him money, fame, happiness, or even self-confidence. And when she was through with him, she scattered his bones in the wilderness. Now, according to Frye, because the land in Thomson's paintings is unlived in and unvisualized, the mind of Thomson and the viewers of the painting cannot contemplate it without turning it into the monstrous, hence the Sphinx. Now, I love the idea of a Sphinx with a mystery to be solved. And in my studies of Thomson and his work, I happened across a mystery of my own. If Thomson's paintings are not sinister depictions of an inhospitable land, what are they? What does the Canadian Sphinx have to reveal to us? Now, when I first encountered it, Frye's interpretation seemed flawed. I knew the country Thomson painted, and it was hardly the far north. It is cottage country, and has been since my great-grandfather built his cottage in 1902. Cottages dotted the landscape of many of the lakes in Algonquin Park, as well as hotels, even a children's summer camp. Large-scale lumber operations punctuated countryside, and a railway cut across the park. While forests dominated and farms and cities were absent, Algonquin Park was most certainly lived in. Is it possible that despite the park rangers, tourists, and cottagers, Thomson felt the land was inhospitable, even monstrous? Is that what we see in his landscapes? Now, at 13, my attention soon wandered to post-punk music and Dungeons and Dragons and girls with Dorothy Hamill bobs and dancing eyes, but somewhere in my mind, the dissonance remained. So fast forward to the winter of 2014 in Toronto. Now a happily married, middle-aged father of two living in West End Toronto, I had taken a year off my work as an advertising copywriter to write a book about Tom Thomson. It started off as a straightforward biography in a style meant to capture the gorgeous colors and staccato poetry of his sketches. As I wrote it, it became something else. That dissonance I felt in my childhood began to reassert itself when I wrote about Thomson's cousin, William Brodie, who was the director of the biology department at the Provincial Museum in the early 20th century. So Brodie was an amateur naturalist who became a key member of the scientific community in Toronto. He embraced Darwin's theory of evolution at a time when many believed God had ordained mankind to have dominion over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. In a literal as well as spiritual sense, he believed that humans were a part of nature, not a part from nature. Maybe during the many walks and talks they had together, Brodie told Thomson that humans, that Thomson himself, was an integral part of the natural world. Maybe when Thomson painted those wild landscapes, he was showing us the vibrant, vital nature in which we belonged, as opposed to an inhospitable, sinister world in which we have no place. Could this be the answer to the mystery of the Canadian Sphinx? I found a crucial clue in the archives deep in the bowels of the Royal Ontario Museum. In a nondescript cardboard box amongst yellow letters and sepia photographs was the private journal of William Brodie. So this is the mystery in my mind. And as I said, the mystery of his death is I feel has been covered very well. Roy McGregor, some of you might have read, yes, okay. So Roy McGregor wrote a fabulous book, very convincing argument about where Thomson is buried and the subject of his death. But I wanted to examine, what drove him to do all these paintings and how he managed to do it without a formal art school education. So let's talk about Thomson for a minute. The vision most of us have of Tom Thomson is this sort of innocent farm boy turned outdoorsman who is canoeing and fishing and camping, very naturally. And the fact is, it's not quite that simple. The reason we have this picture of Thomson is because his friends and coworkers who became the group of 7, they wanted to become the interpreters of Canadian nature. And the challenge for them is all of them except for MacDonald were educated in Europe. This is how they brought all this post-impressionism. They worked with them. They studied in Europe with European painting techniques. 3 of them were born in Europe. So they needed a guide to legitimize them as these painters of the Canadian landscape. They needed Thomson to be this farm boy, this sort of archetypical Canadian. So the truth is, Thomson was born on a farm just outside of Owen Sound. But when I say just outside, I mean you could walk there, you can see it. And at the time, Owen Sound was the Chicago of the North. There were Lakers coming in with potash and wheat. There were trains coming in from the east with goods, and they were, being offloaded and onloaded. This was a bustling city. Thomson was a suburbanite. That was his upbringing, and Thomson lived there into his 20s, and he wanted to become a machinist. Obviously, that didn't happen. Apparently, he got into a quarrel with the boss, and he left and he joined his brothers in Seattle. Now, again, Seattle was not a small town. At this point, at the turn of the century, Seattle had boomed in the gold rush at the end of the 19th century, and it was a pretty rough town. This is where the term Skid Row originates from. This was a rough, tough town. And Thomson loved it. He lived there with his brothers, and they went dancing, and which Thomson loved to do, and they saw music, and they went to see sporting events. This is someone who enjoyed living in the city. This is a city dweller, a suburbanite who has become a city dweller. And when he moved to Toronto, it was more of the same. So I'd like to read just a couple anecdotes from some of his family and friends that sort of illustrate this side of Thomson. Okay, so this is in Seattle. Something that his brother Ralph wrote in a letter to one of Thomson's early biographers. Whenever there was any good music at the theaters, Tom and I were usually there. We nearly always were on hand early to rush the gallery and get in the front row. Okay, and in Toronto, something from another brother, Fraser. When Tom's brother Fraser visited Toronto, they watched the slumping Toronto Maple Leafs play baseball at Hanlon's Point, strolled along the boardwalk, did King Street on a Saturday night, and caught the Mendelssohn Choir at Massey Hall. So that's something else. The Toronto Maple Leafs started out as a baseball team, but they always sucked. And I'm a fan, so. Okay, so another picture of Thomson. This is from an actual photograph of Thomson that you can see. At 29, Tom turned out Natalie in silk shirt, peg-top pants, and horned shoes, danced at the Centre Island Pavilion and the ballroom of the Gladstone Hotel with Elizabeth Artie McCarnan. Together they explored the Art Museum and the Fine Art Building at the Canadian National Exhibition. And finally, Tom's sister Minnie visited Toronto. She recalled, "We had a wonderful visit together. He knew the most delightful tea rooms, and one day he took me to McConkey's. I had not been there before and remarked on what a delightful place it was, how cool and restful, and on the beautiful service and delicious food. And Tom said, 'I would like to eat here always, but one can't on $15 a week.' That was what he received when he came to Toronto. He actually made $11 a week. I think he lied to his sister. After a while, he said, 'I like the atmosphere of the place and the class of people who come here.' I wonder if any of his artist friends ever suspected Tom's hunger for the refinements and niceties of life. His choosing of the more primitive mode of living was rather of necessity than preference." So that's a slightly different picture than we see of Thomson. There's another anecdote I want to share with you. This is from Mark Robinson, who was a park ranger and a friend of Thomson's. So Thomson started going to Algonquin Park in 1912, and this is from around that time, one of his first visits. Tom agreed to take some tourists, Leonard Mack and Harry Bracken, trout fishing on Crown Lake. That evening, as he prepared to depart, a storm was brewing. Shannon Fraser, he was the owner of a lodge where Thomson stayed. Shannon Fraser, recognizing his inexperience, advised him to wait until tomorrow. "For God's sake, don't say anything to them," Tom begged. "I'm their guide." So, Thomson might have been partially responsible for the stories of his abilities in the outdoors, but he certainly wasn't born that way. There's a story actually that Thomson's dad wouldn't allow him to canoe because he thought it was too dangerous. He grew up by Owen Sound, so right on Georgian Bay. We know he had a rowboat that he used to like to go in with his friends, but possibly no canoeing until he started to go on out trips. Okay, so there's a slightly more nuanced picture of Thomson. Yes, the camping, yes, living really summers in Algonquin from about 1914 on. But no, that's not all he was. We're talking about someone who had gone not to one school, but two schools. He went to two business colleges, and that's how he became a graphic designer. He studied in Chatham, Ontario, and then in Seattle at his brother's institution in Seattle. His brother George was like the sort of standard overachiever older brother who sort of makes all the other brothers look sort of bad in comparison. George was a lawyer, but that wasn't enough, so then he founded this college in Seattle, but that wasn't enough, so then he became a landscape painter, a fairly successful one. So he actually was the first painter in the Thomson family, not Tom, George. That said, George lived a long life and he would have seen his brother supersede him from probably the 1920s on, although he kept painting along with another sister, Margaret. So it was an artistic family. So something about Tom that I think is relevant here is um, Tom had some major setbacks in his life, and I think it affected him strongly. Again, we have this overachiever brother that's doing amazing things. Got married, founded this school, became a lawyer, had a son, and Tom's just kind of moving along. He messes up his job as a machinist at Owen Sound, right? Gets his schooling in Chatham, goes to Seattle with his brothers, and then there was a failed romance in Seattle. Again, lots of theories on what happened. No one really knows for sure. Luckily for us, the young woman that he was in love with lived a long life and actually became a romance novelist, sort of the early version of Harlequin romance, and wrote these books. And so she wrote a book about a young painter. Then they had this romance, and things went wrong, and he left. And that's exactly what happened. Is Thomson sort of fled from Seattle. So that's sort of a second failure, and now he finds himself in Toronto. He's in his late 20s, a time when most men were married and starting families. Very few men didn't marry at this time. So Thomson would have stood out a little bit, and I think he probably didn't feel great about himself, again, with his other brothers, following the standard route: marriage, success, families. Okay, so we've talked about Tom, we've talked about the mystery. Let's talk about William Brodie. As I mentioned in the beginning, William Brodie was a cousin, but because he was older than Tom's father, they called him Uncle William. And he was a really interesting fellow. He came from Scotland as a boy and settled north of Pickering, Ontario. And he always loved nature. Super interested in bugs and making little sketches and stuff. But like a lot of immigrant families, he was really driven to make money to support the rest of the family. So he became a dentist. And I think at the time, no disrespect to dentists, but I think at the time it was, you study for a summer. and they let him to pull out people's teeth. So he became a dentist, but there was no established dental college. I suspect it was a very frightening event to go to the dentist. If it's not for you already, it would have been more frightening. But he always loved nature. And this is a great story. In all his free time, he would collect insects, and he'd take pictures and draw sketches of trees. And he started to write articles for various magazines, and he had this enormous collection of insects. You see on movies and stuff where they put the pin in the insect, and I imagine it was something like that, but tens of thousands of things. And so what he did is he said to the Provincial Museum, what became the Royal Ontario Museum, he said, look, I've got this amazing collection of all these local bugs, and you can have it, but I get a job. You have to hire me. And so that's how he got his job at the Royal Ontario Museum. Now he died shortly after the turn of the century, but he was there for 10, 15 years, and you can still read about him. There's a group called the Brodie Boys. They didn't allow girls to be part of it. It's typical sexism of the time. But so these boys could come and go to the museum, and they would do nature walks and learn about the local nature. So this is the sort of impact Brodie had. And this is the man that Tom would have spent a lot of time with once he came back to Toronto in 1904. Now, the other thing that I think is really important to bear in mind is Brodie, he's about the same age as Tom's dad. His son drowned. His son drowned right around the turn of the century. And, I can only imagine, how horrible it is to lose a child, to lose a son. But then this cousin comes in, he's flunked out of his machine shop in Owen Sound. He escapes a romance from in Seattle. He comes to Toronto. I imagine, he really needed someone. And I think that William Brodie needed him. I talk about in my book how there was sort of a boy-shaped hole in his life. And then here's his cousin Tom, So We don't know lots about Thomson. We don't know lots about their relationship, but we have stories that they walked and talked together. So I'm just going to read a little bit more about Brodie and my take on his role in this mystery. First, I'm going to take a drink of water. It is likely that Thomson had already met William Brodie, his grandmother's cousin, at some point. But it was in Toronto that they began to spend a significant amount of time together. Because of their age difference, Tom called him Uncle William. It was also in Toronto where Brodie would explain the connection between man and nature that enabled Thomson to find his connection to his land. It was said of Brodie that he had not only the eye of the scientist and of the artist, but his philosophical mind sought an explanation for what he saw. Then, as now, Toronto was a major urban center, packed with many neighborhoods, rich and poor, but also riven with ravines, rivers, and parks. It was in these green spaces that Thomson and Brodie walked for hours, observing nature. The green spaces were a welcome escape from the cramped boarding houses and the dirty, crowded neighborhoods in which Thomson lived and worked. The traditional view of Thomson's work that Professor Fry articulated is that the unlived-in landscapes he painted had a sinister, even monstrous quality. But this is exactly the opposite view Brodie likely would have held of Thomson's Algonquin Park, or any other landscape for that matter. Brodie embraced Charles Darwin's view that humans were an integral part of nature, not apart from it. Nature wasn't something outside of us, it was us. Even though Darwin had published his revolutionary ideas decades before, in the early 20th century, it was far from being generally accepted or even understood. So fast forward again, a century or two to 2014. I was intrigued by the descriptions I'd read about Brodie, especially in Joan Murray's Tom Thomson Design for a Canadian Hero. Following a lead found in the notes, I made an appointment at the Royal Ontario Museum's archive. I penciled my request for the William Brodie fawns, donned my white cotton gloves, and dug into the boxes full of papers when they arrived. In amongst his articles on tree galls, insects, and birds, I found his personal journal. Once I deciphered his handwriting, I saw that rather than being full of personal appointments or daily reminiscences, it was filled with his philosophical musings. With a mixture of science and spiritualism, he pondered the meaning of life. Unlike most of us, he came up with some answers. It is the aim and function of philosophy to construct intelligence out of nature, to construct nature out of intelligence, to express one in terms of the other, and to demonstrate the harmony and unity of the two. So what I understand this to mean, is that it's our purpose as intelligent beings to understand our existence. We do this by constructing intelligence out of nature, which means observing the world around us, the landscape of which we are an integral part, and building knowledge based on those observations. Now, this is certainly what naturalists like Brodie did, but it applies to all branches of the sciences. Think about Sir Isaac Newton deducing the law of gravity by watching apples fall from a tree. I would further argue that the observation of nature is the basis of all the arts and sciences, all human enterprise, and I think Brodie would too. We understand our existence by constructing nature out of intelligence. We do this when we use the systems of thought and the bodies of knowledge that arise from our observations of nature, the sciences and the arts, to understand the natural world around us. Demonstrating the harmony between the two. This is the kicker for me. When we understand that the intelligence, the arts and sciences, which we use to understand nature, itself arises from our observation of nature, we understand that there is no conflict between the two, between human intelligence and nature. There is harmony, because one arises from the other and vice versa. There is harmony because, as Darwin explained, humans are an integral part of nature, not apart from it. So what Brodie describes is nature observing itself, understanding itself. As I struggled to square Brodie's vision with Thomson's paintings, Fry's Sphinx loomed large. Could this be the answer to the riddle of the Canadian Sphinx? I decided I had to gather more evidence before I confronted her with an answer. So, did I lose anyone on that? It's pretty heavy. I had time to kind of process it when I read it, but I mean, basically, what I think he was saying is, things like language and mathematics, these didn't exist before people thought them up, right? These are systems that we developed, and we would have developed them by observing nature, by looking at counting the rocks on the ground, by watching the ants, cart away food. So all the arts and sciences really come from observation of nature around us. And then we use these systems that we've created, mathematics, science, and all that stuff, to explain the world around us, right? The lake has become too acid to sustain certain species of fish. All the sciences come from our observation of nature, and then we use them, and the arts too, colors, mixing colors, understanding contrasting colors. Then we use them to understand the nature around us. And to understand that we're an integral part of nature, we can actually look at these systems and the things we've created with them, the paintings, the E equals MC squared, all the things we've come up with, and realize that it really just shows the harmony between the two. So I think on some level, he got this idea through to Thomson, and I think it had an effect on Thomson. And even better, I think I can prove it. All right, we'll see. We'll see if you guys are still with me. Okay. So Thomson was very fortunate when he came to Toronto that Brodie was there for him emotionally. His family was up in Owen Sound. That's a train trip away, but still, I think it would have made a big difference to have a friendly face. The other thing that was extremely fortunate is, as I said, Thomson worked in graphic design and advertising, and not his first gig in Toronto, but his second gig was at a place called The Grip. And it was there he met many of the members of what would become the Group of Seven. But before they were the Group of Seven, they were graphic designers like Thomson, and they formed this very supportive group. And I just want to paint a little picture of what that would have been like for him. The Grip's art room had a schoolhouse scheme of desks laid out in rows of celluloid collars, neckties, and waistcoats. Suspended in a blue haze of tobacco was the thrum of male voices, scratching pens. MacDonald's desk, J.E.H. MacDonald, who was one of the supervisors there, was a tangle of sketches, pens, brushes, and books with a corner clear for working. At first, Tom was an inconspicuous presence, quiet, hardworking, and at 31, older than everyone in the department, save MacDonald and Robson. Robson was the big boss who ran everything. He watched but did not join the horseplay, wrestling, stamping, kicking, and hanging from the steam pipes. I don't know how they didn't burn their hands. He smoked his pipe, feculent smoke issuing from his Hudson's Bay tobacco, and laid Ben-Day tints on metal plates, did some lettering. And this is from Robson. When more arrogant souls despised the Ben-Day, and incidentally were no good at running it, Thomson took it in his stride. Aware of his undoubted and varied skills, he never threw his weight around, as do those who feel inferior. It was not beneath his dignity to attend to those jobs calling for Ben-Day shading. He had no wisecracks to offer, no prescription for the good life, nor any particular philosophy of life. Thomson's silence was matched by the silence of MacDonald. Silence seemed to grow around MacDonald. It was not willful, nor forced or assumed priestly. Tom found it impossible to knock heads with MacDonald or Robson. Both were encouraging, patient, and kind. His co-workers in the art room were a motley bunch. Frank Johnson, an irreverent joker, and his brother, Bob. Harry Jackson, an avid angler who'd fished much of the East Coast. Tom McLean, who'd worked as a prospector and fire ranger up north. And Stanley Kemp, an intellectual who had studied to be a minister. Now, coincidentally, Kemp would one day become the father-in-law of the very same Northrop Frye, who would write the influential interpretation of Thomson's work. I can't tell you how many strange coincidences I encountered while writing this book, but I thought that was really cool. So one of Thomson's coworkers and friends, his daughter would go on to marry Northrop Frye, who wrote the Thomson. Small world. Okay. So we know a little bit about Tom, maybe a little clearer picture. We've heard about Brodie. So let's talk about Algonquin Park, because that is a very important piece of the puzzle. So with the help of William Brodie, J.E.H. MacDonald, and his friends from the Grip, Thomson managed to overcome the demon of self-loathing born from his past failures, romantic and professional. He had a job he enjoyed and started going on sketching expeditions, or sketchpeditions as I call them, into the green spaces of Toronto and beyond to paint landscapes with his friends. Thomson shared Brodie's visions of humans as an integral part of nature and would begin to process this concept through his art. It was at this time that something happened. It's nothing I've ever read a satisfying explanation of. Nothing certainly that Thomson wrote about, and if he told anyone about it, we have no record. Something happened on Thomson's trip to Algonquin Park that caused him to keep coming back to paint it every year until his death. Thomson's companion in Algonquin, Harry Jackson, said Tom only really started to paint after, not during, their trip. Although Thomson may have fished more than he painted on their Algonquin trip, this is 1912, the first time Thomson went just for about a month with a friend from work. When he chose to paint, he did not go back to Northern Ontario, where he sketched with Grip co-worker William Broadhead, or to Georgian Bay, where he would sketch at the invitation of Dr. James McCallum, his future benefactor. Thomson went back to Algonquin Park again and again. But why? Aside from being close to Huntsville, where his friend Doc McRuer lived, Algonquin Park was also a place where William Brodie had visited. In fact, William Brodie was involved in the establishment of Algonquin Park. When Thomson saw the Algonquin landscape, he thought of his uncle. He saw there a vital landscape that had been changed by human enterprise, but was no less vital for those changes. Or as poet A.J.M. Smith wrote in the lonely land. This is the beauty of strength, broken by strength, and still strong. Although Brodie was dead by then, Thomson could feel close to him by visiting the landscape Brodie had visited, painting the park he helped to establish. It was here in this landscape, almost literally, that had been changed by humans, that Thomson felt an integral part of nature. It was here he could construct nature out of intelligence by painting vibrant portraits of a vital landscape in which we belonged, of which we were an integral part. I was one step closer to the riddle of the Canadian Sphinx, but another piece remained missing. And I'm going to tell you what it is. But before I do that, something that changed the course of history, literally, and changed the course of Thomson's life, I think, was World War I. You know, if you can imagine Tom Thomson, you know, he's come to Toronto after this failed romance, after a sort of failed career. He gets a great job with a bunch of friends who are really supportive. He starts to paint. He starts to sell paintings, and World War I happens almost immediately. And very shortly, his teacher, A.Y. Jackson, enlists and goes to war. Shortly after, Harris enlists and goes to war. If you can imagine at the time, the government was spending money on buying paintings. That stopped. People stopped doing as much advertising. There were fewer tourists in Algonquin Park, so Thomson didn't have any income from guiding. So this was a very challenging time for Thomson. By 1914, Thomson was back on top. Unlike his time in Seattle, he didn't have a serious relationship, or at least not a relationship he was serious about. But he did have a calling in landscape painting, a patron in Dr. James McCallum, who was paying his bills for the year, a teacher in A.Y. Jackson, who would help him develop his distinct style, and a support network in the Hot Mush Painters. That's what they called the future group of seven. They thought the paintings looked like people were just flipping porridge on a canvas. Hot mush. Thomson still visited his family in Owen Sound, but he also had a family in the painters with whom he lived and worked. Most importantly, he had found his landscape in Algonquin Park, the land William Brodie told him about. Tragically, the war threw Thomson's world into disarray. His friends scattered, the tourist trade in Algonquin Park and the design work in Toronto dried up, and government spending on the arts disappeared as well, reallocated to the war effort. Amazingly, Thomson did not cut and run as he had in Seattle. Even without the moral support of his painter friends and the financial support of the government purchases, he persevered. He channeled his loneliness, his money worries, even the war itself, into his painting. What he lacked in formal art school learning, he gleaned from his friends or was taught by them. He synthesized their lessons into a unique style that emerged under Jackson's tutelage and flowered during the desolation of war. Some may see the desolation of war in Thomson's vibrant landscapes, but with Brodie's philosophy in mind, you can easily see the exact opposite: life, not death. Look at Jackson's A Copse Evening, 1918, or Varley's German Prisoners. These are landscape paintings that show the desolation of war. The trees are blasted, the landscape beaten and muddied. Compare Thomson's landscapes during the war years. They're full of life, vibrant, vital. A statement by Thomson, perhaps, that in the midst of death, Thomson referred to the war as the machine, there is still life. With guidance from his painter friends, Tom learned to paint a landscape that pulls the viewer in. This is accomplished by having a foreground one must look beyond to see the middle ground. Jackson's red maple used a sapling as a screen, not to keep the viewer out, but to intrigue them, to coyly draw them in. Thomson employed this technique in Northern River. But Thomson began to do something his friends had not taught him. In the background of an increasing number of landscapes, Thomson began to paint a way in, a distant entrance, promising something beyond a purely aesthetic experience. That discovery hit me like a flash of lightning in the dim quiet of the National Gallery in Ottawa. I saw it in Thomson's masterpiece, The Jack Pine, and afterwards I began to find it in his other paintings as well. Could this be the final piece of the puzzle? Was I ready to answer the riddle of the Canadian Sphinx at last? Yes, but I don't expect you to come with me yet. I'm going to prove it. So I'm sorry I haven't got a whole bunch of paintings we can look at, but I promise you, if you look, you will see it. Are you looking? So you can, now, so in a number of his paintings, the Jack Pine's the perfect example, you can see not only the background, but in the background, there's a passage through the distant hills, whether they're tree covered or more abstract, they don't meet. There's a space in between them. And this isn't just one painting. I'll talk about some of the other ones, but this is a number of paintings. And sometimes it's not in the sketch, but he puts it in the canvas after. So this is purposeful. Okay. Could be. I like that. I think Thomson would have been a Cohen fan for sure. Okay. All right. So I'm going to try and, I keep saying paint a picture, but that's a little too on the nose. Let me illustrate how this might have looked. Tom struggled with the sky in West Wind. He couldn't capture it in the sketch and failed with the canvas as well. Scraped and repainted, but still couldn't get it right. Tom abandoned that canvas and began work on the Jack Pine, starting with an undercoat of burnt sienna, a sanguine aura for the trees and the distant shore. Tom roughed in the central tree. How human it is, like Christ at Calvary, leafy thieves on either side, but it's more a pieta than a crucifixion scene by the attitude of the tree's limbs. The longest bough lolls to the left, or is it gesturing towards the distant shore? A signpost? Tom adds an ingress to the shore, a space between the royal blue hills, a passage through to the distant cobalt shore, an invitation to enter. In fact, it's more than an invitation. It's a truth told. Man is a part of nature, not apart from nature. Tom transposed the sky and the reflective lake face from his sketch, A Lake in Autumn, to the Jack Pine, horizontal lines in a spectrum of greens and yellows. Now, picture this. As Tom stares at his masterpiece, the chemical wedding of his lithe Art Deco and staccato sketching styles, he floats past the outstretched limb, over the still, sky-streaked lake, through the narrows to that far distant cobalt shore. I have to admit, I'm pretty nervous now that it comes down to it. I'm not an art historian, not an art critic, but here I am challenging the ideas of one of Canada's foremost thinkers. What will the Thomson experts think, the ones I've admired and referenced in my book? Will they think I'm tilting at windmills rather than riddling with sphinxes. Thomson was surviving the stress and the straitened circumstances of war. He had found the landscape that resonated with him, the landscape in which he felt an integral part. And he was continuing to develop his own style, building on the techniques of his fellow hot mushers. He was putting William Brodie's philosophy into practice, using his paintings to construct intelligence out of nature, nature out of intelligence, and demonstrating the harmony between the two. Thomson's paintings were inspired by the landscape, and the landscapes came to life in his paintings. Tom's painter friends and several art critics who reviewed his work experienced that harmony. It is a sense of the vitality of nature, but there was something more. Thomson had found a way to invite the viewer into his landscape, a way that could help them see themselves as an integral part of nature. From 1916, you can begin to see a pattern in Thomson's paintings. Look past the foreground that intrigues the viewer and draws them coyly in, past also the mid-ground rivers and lakes. In the background, on the distant shores, he begins to paint a pathway in. Half a lifetime after I first felt the dissonance of the traditional interpretation of Thomson's works, I had an alternative. Thomson wasn't painting an unvisualized land with a sinister something concealed within. He was painting an invitation to a vital, vibrant landscape, a place we belong. This is what I saw in the jack pine, and subsequently found in the West Wind, in the Northland, Petawawa Gorges, after the sleet storm, and several others. For me, this was the final piece of the puzzle. Thomson, consciously or unconsciously, put a pathway into his paintings. An invitation to the viewer not just to become a part of the scene, but to go beyond the landscape, through it, to become a part of nature. So here's the complete argument. 1. Thomson's elderly cousin and self-taught naturalist, William Brodie, told him about his post-Darwin philosophy, about how art could connect people with nature, could confirm our place as an integral part of nature. 2. Thomson painted the Algonquin landscape because he felt connected to it as Brodie had before him. 3. Thomson consciously or unconsciously painted a pathway into many of his later paintings, not only to draw viewers into his landscape, but also to invite them to enter nature itself, to take their place as an integral part of nature. Could this be the answer to the Canadian Sphinx, the rebuttal to Fry's interpretation of Thomson's work? Or will the Canadian Sphinx tear me to bits, scattering my bones in the wilderness, as Fry wrote it did to Thomson? I began to assemble my argument, to integrate it into my biography. It was in the final years of Thomson's career, of his life, that he created his pathway paintings. He spent more of his time up in the park in those years and had even fewer painter friends around him because of the war. In the absence of supportive painter friends and under increasingly difficult financial constraints, we do know Thomson often worried about money. He mentioned it in some of his letters. It must have been difficult for Thomson to stick with painting. Although he had run away from difficulties in the past, his apprenticeship in Owen Sound, his life in Seattle, he didn't stop painting. In fact, his production during this time was prodigious, and the quality was the best of his career. The idea of running away must have crossed Thomson's mind, though, because he wrote his father in 1917, "I did not send any paintings to the OSA exhibition this year, and I have not sold many sketches, but I think I can manage to get along for another year at least. I will stick to painting as long as I can." But he didn't run away. Instead, he did something few painters had ever accomplished. He made a painting a day for 62 days straight, a daily record of the weather for what was to be the last spring of his life. Instead of leaving, he embraced both painting and the landscape, the daily weather, even more deeply. This record is also redolent of William Brodie's influence. Brodie told his protege, naturalist Ernest Thompson Seton, to keep a journal of his travels. He said, "You will value it more each year." As Joan Murray posited in Tom Thomson Design for a Canadian Hero, Tom likely received the same advice from Brodie and was putting it into action. So, if you're still with me, we have in Tom's paintings not an inhuman, sinister something, but an invitation to be part of vibrant, vital nature. The Sphinx has her answer, but the strokes on Thomson's paintings, the facts of Tom's life, remain unchanged. And I just want to read one last passage to you. Despite many books about Thomson and his art, he remains as enigmatic and inaccessible as many found him in life. A solitary genius, remote, reticent, an unschooled prodigy, harsh, brittle, brilliant, uncouth. Questions around his death buzz about his life and art, distract from his accomplishments. Hundreds of sketches, dozens of canvases in less than 4 years. A vibrant, startlingly original style that continues to influence artists, capture the imagination of a nation a century after his death. Now Thomson's paintings adorn the walls of major Canadian galleries, tour the world to acclaim, adorn calendars, coffee mugs, t-shirts. The remaining private paintings are auctioned for millions. As with Yeats, elegized by Auden, Thomson became his admirers. He has been simplified in death, details erased, attributes and incidents harmonized to suit his biographers' designs. The paintings, though, remain unchanged. Waves slap at the rocky shoreline, the wind takes form in the trees, the scent of the sun on the fallen pine needles. I urge you to visit the McMichael Gallery in Kleinburg, the National Gallery in Ottawa, the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, or any gallery that displays his work. Whether or not you think about Thomson, Brodie, or Fry, just look. As you look, see if something inside you answers back. Consider whether something within you recognizes itself, is responding to an invitation. If you are so fortunate to receive such an invitation, I strongly urge you to accept. Thank you. If I haven't eaten up all my time, do I have time for some questions? I do. Gail says yes. So please. You know what? I keep discovering more and more. I know on my shelf I have 24, and there are a couple books of poetry I don't own. And you know, every time there's a new show, there's a new book as well. So yeah, I mean, it's in the dozens, and I don't think the hundreds yet, but there's so many fabulous ones. And one of the best things about writing this book is I've got to talk to a couple of other Thomson authors. Jeff Taylor wrote Tom Thomson's Last Bonfire, which is this really cool imagining of a couple of his friends sitting around a bonfire, basically holding vigil. Before his body was buried, they kept it in the lake. At the time, that was the best they could do for refrigeration. And so he imagines the conversations they had and you know, what they thought about Thomson. Another fellow I talked to, a professor of theater in Windsor. Oh gosh, what was the name of that book? It'll come to me. But he wrote a play for Canada's 150th anniversary about Thomson. He thought, what am I going to write about that sort of sums up Canada for me? And he wrote about Thomson because he felt, he's really our icon. He's our William Tell. He's our national hero. And he wrote about his play starts after Thomson's death as well. If you can picture it, I haven't seen it staged, but he describes the play in his book. There's a canoe at the top of the stage, and the actor who plays Thomson and subsequently all these people in Thomson's life is underneath the canoe and starts to sort of contemplate his life. What was my life? What am I becoming now? And so it's this very interesting sort of summation of his life and trying to understand who he was and what he had accomplished. Are there any other questions? Please. He was not a member. That's right. And actually, I did an interview with a Muskoka radio station, and the interviewer asked me a really interesting question, which I hadn't actually thought about. His question was very similar to yours. If Thomson had lived, would he have become a member of the Group of Seven? And I actually find that a very difficult question to answer, because Thomson is famous for not being a joiner. He probably went to lunch at the Arts and Letters Club dozens of times, and all of his friends belonged to it, but he was never a member. And people said, well, he's not a joiner. He doesn't want to be part of a group. But I imagine if MacDonald asked him to join, that he would have done it, because they had almost this father-son relationship, even though he was just 5-6 years older. And I can't see Thomson saying no to MacDonald. So I think probably I think he probably would have been a member, but it wasn't formed until I want to say 1920. Yeah. Please. Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously, Brodie's sort of central to my book, and as I read, Joan Murray, who in my mind is the preeminent Thomson scholar, she was the first one, as far as I know, to recognize that Brodie's significance, that he played a factor in his life, in terms of his family, Thomson himself only wrote a few letters. And we have reminiscences from his family, and they claim that they adored him and they were very close. But I believe that Thomson felt like a black sheep, whether his family felt that way or not. I imagine so. I mean, imagine this large family in this Scottish-Canadian suburb, and everyone else, the sisters, his older sisters are married, and they marry farmers, and they live in the area. The brother's a lawyer, married, children. The other brothers are all getting settled, and Thomson is living this nomadic life. Yeah, I think probably it would have been, questions would have come up, and maybe they did feel embarrassed. The father, though, John Thomson, was a very interesting character, and he had a reputation for being very eccentric. So it's possible that in some ways they might, maybe behind his back would have said, well, he's a chip off the block.
Somewhere I read, it might have been in the introduction to, or the advertisement for your lecture, that Tom was also an admirer of classical music. But I also read somewhere, I don't remember where, that Tom, when he was living in his hut, I'll call it a hut, the wooden shack in the ravine, one of the ravines in Toronto, had a wealthy older woman artist who would come to his shack, I guess I'll shack again, and help train him a little bit in art and in painting. And maybe there was some sort of a relationship there. And there was something about a ring that I had read. But anyway, do you know anything about an older, sophisticated woman artist who might have been a friend of Tom's that might have helped him in some teaching him a little bit about art?
Well, you're talking about Frances McGilvery.
Okay.
Yeah. So Frances McGilvery was, about less than 10 years, but older than Thomson. And yes, Thomson apparently told his friend Mark Robinson that she is the only person who really gets what I'm trying to do. And when they took the effects from his body, he had her business card. He held on to it. Her business card. So obviously she meant something to him.
When his body was found, he had that
Yes.
person?
Yes. Yeah. So she was from a middle class family, from where Thomson's grandparents settled, just north of Owen Sound, Claremont. So she was from there as well, and from where William Brodie grew up as well. So they were from the same world in some ways, and she was an excellent painter. I think probably we don't know her because women's work was not as valued as men's. I was about to say in the early 20th century, but let's be honest, still. So yeah, she's an excellent painter. And we have evidence, that they definitely spent some time together towards the end of his life, and there, I have heard that she visited him in his shack, which was the studio building. It still exists in Toronto. It's right by the subway, Bloor subway station. The shack was moved to Kleinburg, but the studio building is still there. This is a building that James McCallum and Lauren Harris financed, with these big studios and beautiful windows in Rosedale Valley, which at the time was the sort of north extent of Toronto. And the idea was that they would all have their studios there. And so for after it was built, Thomson and Jackson shared a studio space and probably lived there too. I imagine it didn't smell very good. It's all filled with all these men, and they're cooking with these little, I'm not even sure what the plumbing situation was like. But after Jackson went back to Montreal, he couldn't afford the fee. I think it was $10 a month or something. And so they let him move into the shack next door, which was had been a hut for the woodworker or something. I'd have to look at that. But it had existed. Maybe the people that actually built the studio had left their materials in the shack, and in the end, Thomson lived in it, and Lismer, another group of 7 member, they painted together there, and Frances McGilvery would have gone in. I haven't heard about the ring, but as I said, so little is written down about Thomson, and all we really have are these letters and then accounts from family, from his first biographer, Blodwyn Davies. You can find those in the archives in Ottawa, all the letters that the family sent to Blodwyn Davies. So these are great accounts, and this is in the 1930s, so 20 years, 15 years after his death. And then by the time Joan Murray's writing in the 1970s, the people that are alive are very, very old. And some of the stories that come from these men and women in their 80s and 90s, I'm not sure are entirely trustworthy.
Do you know anything about that Tom? I don't know where I read it, but that he was a connoisseur or a fan of classical
100%. Yes. We know. I'd have to look at my own notes to find out where, but we know that he saw the Mendelssohn Choir in Toronto, and so I think yes, we know at least that he liked. But I think he was a lover of all kinds of music. You know, he played the mandolin, and there are many people talking about how he played, and you know, probably was more like folk music. He was part of a band in Leith before he left. There was just a group of again all boys, and they played songs for dances. Again, more folk music than classical and pop music of the time. My favorite music story about Thomson, and this is going out a bit, but we know that James McCallum, who financed Thomson, who gave him some money so he could paint, was a huge fan of African American culture at the turn of the 20th century. Now, I imagine that included music, and I like to think that he was one of the first people in Toronto to be collecting what would become jazz music. And I like to think that when he went over and visited the painters as he did, that sometimes he'd bring records and they would listen to W.C. Handy and the foundation of jazz. And I like to imagine that they thought it was awesome.
I'll mention there are letters of Tom's in the Kleinberg Museum, and if you ask nicely, they might give you copies of them.
You can photocopy them, yeah.
James McCallum, is that the same McCallum family that has the beautiful, amazing rustic cottage on George?
Oh yeah, yeah. They don't own it any longer, but yes, yeah. That was his cottage, and Thomson and some of his friends, he paid them to make these paintings, and then the Jackman family are the current owners, I think, and they amazingly said to the National Gallery, "You can take the paintings, and you know, but I want you to have an artist come in and make duplicates so we can enjoy it in our cottage." So you can actually see those timbers from McCallum's cottage in the National Gallery now. So it's no. Eric Jackman's the current owner. Yeah, the Jackman family has been so generous. Yeah, they're big. They're big benefactors of art galleries and whatnot, and you know, letting the National Gallery come in and take down your wall. I mean, that's very generous. Well, I mean, as I said, you can see the timbers in the gallery, but if there's been a book, I'm not sure. Google would know for sure, and it'd probably be available on Amazon. Yeah. Oh, and I'd be remiss. I intended to bring a box of my books. I got it from the publisher, and I had an earlier event, and we sold them all out. So I'm so sorry. I don't have any, but I will say they're available. Any of your favorite bookstores in Ontario will have them, or can lay their hands on them very quickly. And if you can't wait, or if you're at your cottage and you don't want to leave, they're available on Amazon or Chapters Indigo, and they'll deliver. Yes. Right.
Indian, and I wondered what was the relationship between mood speaking and how those were they, and was that the connection to Francis McGilvery, possibly?
Gosh, I don't know that.
Yeah, and also the train that left from directly in the little valley behind my house went directly to City Lake. And he painted all through that little valley.
He certainly did, yeah.
And it was a spectacular place where they straightened out the dawn or whatever that thing they did there.
Right.
But it's always been fascinating to me that as you said, there's something about them. There's a ton of coincidences that I personally have liked about.
Can I tell you one? Can I tell you my favorite coincidence story? Because I had this very cool thing happen. So, as you mentioned, one of the really fascinating things about doing research on this book is, you can actually sometimes get the originals of the letters, and so I found myself holding Thomson's letter, to his dad, and it felt like a holy relic to me. It was so cool. But I think it was in the archives of the McMichael Gallery, I found an angry letter from Thomson's nephew, George Jr. He was complaining about an article in the Maclean's or something that was a bit lurid, and so there was a copy of this letter in the Fonz, and when I looked at the top of it, he had sent it from his work. So he worked at a place called Cockshut Plough from Brantford, Ontario. That was I think the first riding plough in Canada. So that's my great grandfather's company. My mom's a Cockshut, and that was coincidentally that's my great grandfather who built the cottage in Lake of Bays. There's a Cockshut portage you can see on some of the maps. But I'm holding this letter from Tom's nephew, who knew him very well, and it's my own family's business. So that just all the hackles raised on my neck, and what an amazing coincidence. So Thomas Seton, I don't believe that Thomson knew him. We know for sure that Brodie knew him. Brodie was he was Brodie's protege. Brodie, according to Brodie, anyways, taught him a lot. That's a good question. Yeah, Seton and Thomson must have been fairly close in age, and I don't know if they were both in Toronto at the same time. I'm not sure.
Well, I think that book was written around that period that Tom was painting back there.
Well, yeah, I mean, Thomson lived in Toronto from 1904 until 1917 when he died. So if the book was written then,
I think it was written around 1902 or something like that. And he was wandering that valley at that time, and that's what he wrote about in that little book.
yeah, I don't know the answer to that. It seems like if he was around, that Thomson would have been introduced. There's some evidence that Thomson would go over there, and that lots of people did. He was very popular, Brodie, and he'd do these walks, and we know he and Thomson went, and because Thomson took pictures of High Park, of the Scarborough Bluffs, but we don't know who was with them. So it's very possible if Seton Thomson was there at the same time that they would have walked together and would have known each other. But Thomson didn't write letters that survived, and so there's so little we know about him. Yeah. Right. Almost certainly, yeah. So my favorite story about Camp Amek is, I think it's still the original fireplace. That was built by Thomson. He was looking for odd jobs in the summer. He didn't paint so much in the summer. It's more spring and fall. And he took the rocks and built the fireplace.
That was not
That was at the cottage? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if someone was on Canoe Lake, you know, between, for 1912, he was really only there for a few weeks, but subsequently 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, until he died, they would almost certainly know him. Yeah, he was around, and it wasn't a big group. Yes. No, Claremont is north of. I may have misspoken. Claremont is north of Pickering, and that's where Thomson was born. But he was still a baby when John Thomson bought Rosehill, which is the farm outside of Owen Sound on Leith. Yeah, that's right. So this. So this is a huge debate for Thomson fans, with people on either side insisting that he did try and sign up numerous times, or that he would never sign up because he was a pacifist. So. So we know from a first-hand account that he tried to enlist in the Boer War in 1899 when he was still living in Owen Sound. But I don't think we have any first-hand accounts of him trying to enlist in the First World War. His sister, that's not, so to be more specific, his sister said that he did try and enlist, but we don't know if that was an actual conversation she had, or after the fact she was just thinking he was very patriotic. You know, we don't really know. But from one of his coworkers, is it Kemp? I think it's Kemp. One of his coworkers at Grip, there was a book about pacifism that had kind of done the rounds, and apparently Thomson read it and agreed with it. And certainly World War I, a lot of accounts written that we read now make it sound like everyone was all gung-ho for it, but in fact there was a lot of opposition. And a lot of the press at the time, rather than being patriotic, was saying, boy, the conditions are awful, and boy, people are dying in numbers that we could only have imagined. So I think it's very possible that Thomson had objections to the war, but it could also go the other way. You know, Mark Robinson enlisted. He was in his 40s at least. Was he 50? He was quite old to be accepted, but he enlisted and served for a couple of years and came back. So it would have been kind of awkward. And there's always this rumor too that Thomson quarreled with this German American, right? And that gosh, his name's not coming to me, but. That's one story about how he might have died, that they argued about the war and you know, that maybe they shouldn't fight Germany or what have you, and that Thomson was enraged by this. So I don't know. There's a lot of arguments either way. I'd like to think he was a pacifist, but that's 100% me. I really don't know. Are there any other questions or comments? Thank you so much. Thank you.